In the vast and ancient land of Arabia, where golden sands stretched endlessly under blazing suns and cool nights wrapped the dunes in silence, there lived tribes whose lives were shaped by the harsh beauty around them. Trade routes wove across the deserts like lifelines, connecting bustling markets from Yemen to Syria, from Abyssinia to Persia. At the heart of these routes stood Mecca, a small but revered city that had grown around a sanctuary known as the Kaaba, the sacred house, built according to tradition by the prophet Ibrahim and his son, Ismail, as a place devoted solely to the worship of one God. Generations passed, and though the original monotheistic message faded under layers of tribal customs and idols, the sanctity of the Kaaba remained. Every year, tribes from across Arabia made pilgrimage to Mecca, bringing not only offerings to their gods but trade, poetry, stories, and news from distant lands. The Kaaba, black-draped and cube-shaped, was the living heart of Mecca, around which the city's life and commerce turned. Far to the south, in Yemen, ruled a governor named Abraha. Abraha, once a slave who rose through courage and cunning, came under the authority of the Christian kingdom of Aksum in Abyssinia. A devout Christian and ambitious ruler, Abraha dreamed of making Yemen the new spiritual and economic center of Arabia. In Sana'a, he built Al-Qalais, a grand cathedral unlike anything the tribes had seen. Its walls adorned with gold, marble, and precious stones brought by caravans from distant lands. Abraha hoped that the splendor of his cathedral would draw the Arabs away from Mecca, ending their centuries-old tradition of pilgrimage to the Kaaba. Yet the Arabs, fiercely attached to their ancient house, paid little attention. For them, the Kaaba was not merely stone and mortar. It was a symbol of identity, history, and a link to the divine past of Ibrahim. Abraha's frustration grew. Stories tell of an incident that triggered his wrath. Some Meccans, perhaps angered by Abraha's challenge to their sacred center, allegedly defiled the cathedral by sneaking in at night and vandalizing it. Whether this tale was rumor or truth hardly mattered to Abraha, for it became the spark that set his ambition ablaze. He resolved to march upon Mecca, destroy the Kaaba, and force the Arabs to turn to his cathedral in Sana'a. His preparations were vast. An army was assembled, soldiers and auxiliaries drawn from various tribes and regions under his rule. But what made this army unlike any seen before in Arabia was the inclusion of elephants, massive creatures unknown in the desert, whose sheer size and strength symbolized overwhelming power. The caravan of war advanced northward, following the ancient incense routes. As they approached Mecca, panic spread among the Quraysh and other tribes. The sight of elephants, towering and foreign, struck terror into hearts accustomed to camels and horses. The Arabs had fought wars among themselves for centuries, but never against such a force. The Quraysh, custodians of the Kaaba, realized they could not hope to defend the sacred house by force. Among them was Abd al-Muttalib ibn Hashim, a man of noble bearing, known for his dignity and wisdom. He was the grandfather of a yet unborn child who would change the course of history. Muhammad. Tradition narrates that Abd al-Muttalib met Abraha face-to-face, calm and composed. He requested the return of camels Abraha's army had seized. Surprised, Abraha asked why the chief of Mecca showed concern for mere animals rather than the Kaaba itself. Abd al-Muttalib famously replied that he was the owner of the camels and the Kaaba had its own lord to protect it. Abraha, unmoved, prepared his assault. Meanwhile, the people of Mecca, recognizing their powerlessness, withdrew to the surrounding hills, entrusting the fate of the Kaaba to divine protection. Then came the day remembered across generations. As Abraha's elephants were led towards the Kaaba, they refused to advance. Urged, beaten, and directed, the great beasts knelt or turned aside whenever they faced Mecca. At that moment, as recounted in the Quran, in the brief yet powerful chapter, Al-Fil, a miraculous event unfolded. Flocks of small birds, known in Arabic as ababel, appeared in the sky, carrying pebbles of baked clay. These birds dropped their stones upon the invaders, and the army suffered a devastating destruction. The stones did not merely bruise, they inflicted a deadly plague or disease, which decimated Abraha's forces. The mighty elephants, too, perished or fled, and Abraha himself was struck by illness and died on his return south. The Kaaba remained untouched, a symbol that no earthly power could destroy what God had chosen to protect. The Year of the Elephant thus entered Arab memory, not only as a historical event but as a sign of divine intervention and a reminder of the limits of human arrogance. It became a fixed point in the Arab calendar, so significant that many events were dated in reference to it. In that same year, in Mecca, a child was born into the clan of Hashim, grandson of Abd al-Muttalib, and son of Abdullah ibn Abd al-Muttalib. His mother, Amina bint Wahb, would name him Muhammad. This birth, occurring in the very year the Kaaba was saved, deepened the sense among later Muslims that the Prophet's coming was part of a divine plan. The story of the Year of the Elephant carries layers of meaning beyond its historical core. For the Arabs of the desert, it reinforced the sanctity of Mecca and the Kaaba, a sanctuary where even violence had limits. It became a tale told by poets and elders alike, weaving faith, identity, and history into a single narrative. The Quran's verses about this event served as a reminder of God's power to protect the symbols of faith against even the mightiest worldly forces. Generations later, when the Prophet Muhammad received revelation and called his people back to the pure worship of one God, the memory of that year lived in the hearts of those who listened. It offered proof that the house of God was under divine protection, and that truth, not power, would ultimately prevail. Historically, scholars and historians have examined the event from different angles. Some see it as a literal miracle. Others suggest natural explanations, such as disease or epidemic striking Abraha's army. Yet even among historians, the impact of the event itself on Arab consciousness is undeniable. It bound the people of Mecca to their sanctuary more tightly than ever before, turning the Kaaba from a revered shrine into a symbol of miraculous deliverance. The elephants, creatures of foreign lands and foreign kings, came to represent the arrogance of those who sought to impose their will upon the sacred center of Arabia. In the decades that followed, the memory of the Year of the Elephant became part of the Arab identity. Travelers spoke of it, poets referred to it, and even distant tribes knew the story of how an army with elephants had failed before the walls of the Kaaba. For the Quraysh, it added to their prestige. They were not merely caretakers of a tribal idol house. They were guardians of a house protected by God himself. This reputation strengthened their position among the tribes and contributed to Mecca's rise as a center of trade and culture. When Muhammad, now grown, began his mission decades later, the memory of the Year of the Elephant was still fresh among the elders. It was not lost on them that he was born that very year, linking his life to an event already perceived as a sign from God. In sermons and teachings, the Prophet would later emphasize that the Kaaba was meant for the worship of Allah alone, the same God who had protected it long before his message began. The Kaaba's deliverance thus became a historical and spiritual prelude to the coming of Islam. Beyond the walls of Mecca, the event had wider echoes. Abraha's ambition to shift the focus of pilgrimage from Mecca to Sana'a failed completely. Instead, Mecca's status as a spiritual center was only reinforced. Trade routes continued to converge there, bringing wealth and ideas that enriched the city's culture. Poets, traders, and travelers who gathered around the Kaaba exchanged not only goods but verses, stories, and philosophies. The Quraysh, with their newfound prestige, became the stewards of this crossroads, mediators among tribes who might otherwise have clashed. In later Islamic tradition, the Year of the Elephant took on further symbolism. It stood as proof that might alone cannot overcome what is under divine protection. It offered hope to believers in times of difficulty. If God could save the Kaaba from a mighty army, surely he could also protect and guide the new community of faith. The brief but vivid verses of Surah Al-Fil reminded Muslims that history itself bore witness to God's power. The surah's recitation in prayer and teaching connected every generation to that distant year when birds defeated elephants. Over the centuries, historians and scholars preserved the details of this story through works like those of Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, and Al-Tabar. While details vary, some mention a single elephant named Mahmud as the lead beast who refused to advance. What remained constant was the core narrative, an arrogant attempt to destroy the Kaaba thwarted by a miraculous intervention. Travelers from other lands who visited Arabia often heard this story, and it became part of the broader tapestry of Middle Eastern and Islamic folklore. In the modern era, scholars have explored the event in light of archaeology and textual analysis, yet the traditional account still holds a cherished place in Muslim hearts. For believers, the truth of the event lies not merely in the historical facts, but in its moral and spiritual message. It tells of humility, faith, and the futility of arrogance. It tells of how God's will can manifest in the simplest of ways through birds and pebbles, rather than through grand armies. In Mecca today, pilgrims circled the Kaaba, just as they have for centuries, many still remembering the story of the Year of the Elephant. Though the city has grown into a sprawling modern metropolis, the Kaaba itself remains the unchanged heart of it all, a symbol of unity for millions around the world. Each year, during Hajj, the black-draped cube witnesses prayers whispered in every language, tears shed by pilgrims remembering sins, and supplications offered for peace and mercy. And in those moments, the memory of that distant year, when an army failed and faith prevailed, still lingers in the air. In the sands of Arabia, history is never entirely past. It lives on in story and ritual, in verse and prayer. In the hearts of those who remember, the Year of the Elephant is more than a tale of elephants and stones. It is a reminder that the sacred endures, that arrogance falls before humility, and that the plans of the powerful cannot overcome the decrees of the Almighty. From generation to generation, this story has traveled, growing in meaning as new believers found in it not only a miracle of the past, but a sign for all times. In this way, the Year of the Elephant has become eternal, a moment in history transformed into a lesson, a sign, and a hope. And so it remains, as long as pilgrims walk the ancient paths to Mecca. their hearts echoing with faith in the one who protected the Kaaba long before they were born, and who protects hearts that turn sincerely to him still. In the stillness of desert nights, under skies scattered with countless stars, the elders of Quraysh would gather around flickering fires and tell the young ones of the year that changed everything. They would speak of the dust that rose like a dark curtain behind Abraha's army as it marched across the southern roads, of the strange silence that fell over Mecca as people packed what little they could and fled to the rocky hills surrounding the valley, of the sight of elephants kneeling stubbornly in the sand, refusing to advance no matter how furiously the soldiers pulled at their reins and beat their thick hides with whips. They spoke of flocks of birds that seemed to darken the midday sun, each carrying in its tiny claws pebbles of baked clay, and of how those pebbles struck men and beasts alike, spreading sickness and terror until the mighty army, so confident just days before, lay broken and scattered among the desert stones. And in these stories, the Kaaba stood serene and untouched, its dark cloth fluttering gently in the desert breeze, a silent witness to the downfall of pride and the triumph of faith. Children would listen wide-eyed to these stories, sensing even then that the tale carried more than the weight of history. It carried a promise. It told them that no matter how great the power that came against them, there existed a power greater still, unseen but ever present, watching over what was meant to endure. The Quraysh themselves would carry this pride in their blood, a quiet certainty that their guardianship of the Kaaba was not an accident of birth, but part of a larger design. It was this design that gave Mecca its unique place among the scattered and often warring tribes of Arabia. Life in Mecca, after the year of the elephant, returned to its rhythms, but something had shifted in the hearts of its people. Traders still came and went, their caravans heavy with frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silks, but there was a deeper reverence for the black-draped house that lay at the center of the city. Even as idols continued to fill the Kaaba's courtyard, even as poets composed verses in praise of the old gods, the memory of the miraculous deliverance lingered. It was as if the city itself carried a hidden knowledge that the true Lord of the Kaaba was not made of wood or stone. And in that same year, under a sky that had witnessed the flight of birds against elephants, Amina bint Wahb gave birth to a child named Muhammad. He was born into the respected clan of Hashim, but his father, Abdullah, had died before seeing his son's face. This child, destined to bring a message that would reshape hearts and nations, entered the world at a moment already marked by the signs of the unseen. Later generations of believers would see in his birth, timed so closely with the miraculous protection of the Kaaba, a sign of divine preparation, that before the messenger came, God himself had guarded the sacred house he would one day purify. Muhammad grew up an orphan, under the care of his grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib, and then his uncle, Abu Talib. Though young Muhammad was too small to remember the events of the year of the elephant, the story lived around him, told at gatherings, whispered in markets, recited by poets who carried history in their verses. The memory shaped the consciousness of Mecca, giving its people both pride and a sense of responsibility. They were not only merchants and traders, they were custodians of a sanctuary that had been defended not by swords or alliances, but by the will of God. Years turned into decades, and Mecca thrived. Its location, at the crossroads of ancient caravan routes, made it wealthy. Its fairs drew poets and merchants from every corner of Arabia, and its sanctuary brought pilgrims whose presence fed the city's markets. Yet beneath the outward prosperity lay spiritual confusion. Idols crowded the Kaaba, each tribe bringing its own stone or carving, each paying homage to what it believed protected its fortunes. The old stories of Ibrahim and Ismail lingered in fragments, their message dulled by generations of custom and compromise. Still, in moments of quiet reflection, some Meccans must have wondered why the Kaaba had been saved that year, and what message lay behind the flight of birds and the ruin of Abraha's army, when Muhammad, now a man respected for his honesty and gentleness, began to speak of one God, calling his people back to the faith of Ibrahim. The memory of the year of the elephant was still alive among the elders. They remembered how Abraha had failed despite his elephants and soldiers, and though many of them resisted Muhammad's call, the story of the Kaaba's deliverance remained an unspoken backdrop, a reminder that the sacred house did not belong to the powerful, but to the divine. As Muhammad's message spread, it challenged the very foundations of Meccan society. The call to abandon idols threatened not only religious beliefs but also the economic life built around pilgrimage and trade. Opposition grew fierce, and persecution followed. Yet the believers drew strength from faith, recalling the old sign: if God had once protected the Kaaba against an army, could he not protect his messenger too? And though years of hardship and struggle lay ahead, the early Muslims kept the memory of that miracle alive, finding hope in it when the future seemed dark. Beyond Mecca, the year of the elephant became part of a larger history. It entered poetry and prose, chronicles and genealogies. Arab historians, centuries later, would date events before and after it, using it as a marker in the long and complex story of the peninsula. Even after the Prophet's migration to Medina, even after Islam spread beyond Arabia to the great cities of Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and beyond. The memory of that year remained like an ember, glowing quietly in the hearts of the faithful pilgrims, continued to come to Mecca, year after year, century after century, their feet following ancient paths through desert and mountain. The Kaaba, once saved from destruction by the flight of small birds, now stood at the center of a growing world of faith that reached far beyond the sands of Arabia. Each pilgrim, as they circled the sacred house, carried in their heart not only personal hopes and prayers but also the shared memory of a time when God's power had revealed itself so clearly. In the words of the Quran, the story is told with striking brevity and force. Have you not seen how your Lord dealt with the companions of the elephant? Did he not make their plot go astray? And he sent against them flocks of birds, striking them with stones of baked clay, and made them like eaten straw. The imagery is simple, yet vivid. A mighty army reduced to ruin, plans undone not by human resistance but by the smallest of creatures acting by divine command. For believers, these verses are more than history. They are a lesson written in the language of creation itself, that power belongs to God alone, and that arrogance, no matter how heavily armored, must fall before divine will. As Islam spread, scholars and teachers retold the story to new generations. In lands far from Mecca, the mosques of Andalusia, the courts of Delhi, the scholarly circles of Cairo, children learned about the year of the elephant. Calligraphers penned the verses of Seerah al-Fil with devotion, their elegant scripts, giving form to words that had been recited in prayer since the earliest days of the Ummah. Poets found inspiration in the story, seeing in it both a historical event and a symbol of faith's triumph over force. In Mecca itself, centuries passed. The city changed, rulers rose and fell, dynasties built and lost their power, but the Kaaba endured. Pilgrims continued to circle it, chanting prayers first uttered by Ibrahim and Ismail. In quiet moments between rituals, some must have looked at the black stone walls and remembered the story passed down from grandfathers and great-grandfathers, how elephants had knelt in the sand, how a foreign king's ambition had turned to dust, and how a single year had become a sign for all generations. For Muslims, the story remains alive, not as a tale of national pride but as a universal lesson. It teaches that protection and victory come from faith, not from strength of arms or wealth. It reminds hearts hardened by struggle that divine help can come from unexpected places. It speaks to every believer who has faced a seemingly impossible obstacle, whispering that no force is greater than the will of the one who commands the birds and the stones. And so, the year of the elephant continues to live. It lives in the prayers whispered beside the Kaaba, in the verses recited in mosques across the world, in the stories told to children as they drift to sleep under starry skies. It lives in the hearts of pilgrims who, standing in the vast courtyard of the sacred mosque, feel the weight of centuries pressing gently on their souls. They are part of a story that began long before their birth and will continue long after they are gone. Through time, the Kaaba remains as it was, simple in form, profound in meaning, a house not for idols of wood or stone, but for the remembrance of the Creator of all. Its walls have been rebuilt and repaired over the centuries, but its essence has not changed. It stands as a witness to the faith of Abraham and Ismail, to the arrogance of Abraha and its downfall, to the birth of Muhammad and the dawn of Islam, to the prayers of countless souls who have turned to it in hope and humility. And in that story, the year of the elephant is not merely a date. It is a reminder carved into the collective memory of a faith that would grow from the sands of Arabia to touch every corner of the earth. It is a testament that what is protected by God can never be destroyed by men, no matter how mighty they seem. It is a sign that faith, though unseen, is more enduring than stone or empire. So it is that pilgrims still come, their hearts beating with the same hopes that once filled the hearts of those who witnessed the miracle. And as they walk the paths once trodden by prophets and poets, merchants and slaves, they become part of the same unbroken story, a story that began in the hush of dawn, under the shadow of elephants who would not advance, and birds who carried stones that changed the course of history. And so the sands remembered. Even when tongues fell silent and the dust of centuries covered the footsteps of those who once walked there. In the hush of dawn, when the first light touched the black stone of the Kaaba, the memory of that year lay hidden in the hearts of those who came to pray, like a quiet ember burning behind every whispered supplication. Traders who brought silks from Persia and spices from India might boast of fortunes won and lost. But even they lowered their voices when speaking of the house that had stood against an army of elephants. The elders of Quraysh, whose beards had turned white, still carried in their eyes the pride of a city chosen, not by kings or armies, but by the decree of the unseen, and the memory did not fade as new generations were born. Children heard the story from their fathers and mothers, sitting in the courtyards at night while the desert winds stirred the dust. They imagined the massive creatures, the thunder of their feet shaking the earth, the sharp scent of fear in the air as Meccans fled to the hills, and then the sudden, impossible sight of small birds darkening the sky. In those quiet hours, the children learned not only history but humility. The lesson that even the mightiest force can fail before the simplest of God's creations if he wills it. As Muhammad grew from child to man, the story surrounded him like a river surrounds an island. Even if he did not remember the day itself, its meaning wove through the life of Mecca, in every caravan that stopped to water its camels, in every prayer said facing the Kaaba, and as he watched the people circle the sacred house, offering prayers to idols that could neither hear nor help them. Perhaps the memory of that deliverance stirred questions in his heart. Why would the true Lord of the Kaaba save it from destruction, only to leave it in the hands of lifeless stones? The answer to that question, though hidden then, would one day rise within him, shining with the clarity of revelation. The decades that followed the year of the elephant were years of change for Mecca. Trade routes shifted, markets grew busier, and poets from every tribe gathered to recite verses that would echo across the desert. Yet always at the center of the city stood the Kaaba, its black covering catching the desert sun by day and the moonlight by night. Even those who placed idols around it could not deny the deeper sanctity they felt in its presence. A sanctity, born of stories passed from mouth to mouth until they became as real as the stones themselves. When the first words of revelation came to Muhammad in the cave of Seerah, calling him to warn his people and guide them back to the path of Ibrahim, he carried within him the memory of a house once saved by God's will. That memory was not a legend to be admired from afar, but a living sign, a reminder that the Kaaba was meant for a purer faith than the one practiced in the shadow of its walls. And when he stood before the Quraysh calling them to abandon their idols, his words were rooted in a truth older than any stone carving, that the Lord who protected the Kaaba was one without partner, unseen yet closer to hearts than their own breath. Opposition rose swiftly, for the Quraysh feared the loss of their wealth and status, tied so closely to the old ways. They saw in Muhammad's message not only a challenge to belief but to the very order of Mecca itself. Yet even among those who rejected him, the story of the year of the elephant remained. It was harder to dismiss a man who came from the very city saved by God's power, harder to silence a call that echoed the faith of Ibrahim, whose house had been defended by means no army could withstand. As persecution grew, as followers of Muhammad were mocked, beaten, and exiled, they too drew strength from that ancient sign. In the darkness of uncertainty, they remembered that victory did not always come through strength of numbers or weapons. Sometimes, it came through faith alone, as it had in that distant year when small birds defeated elephants. And so they bore hardship with patience, believing that the same Lord who had protected the Kaaba would also protect his messenger and those who believed in him. Years passed, and Muhammad and his followers left Mecca for Medina, carrying little but faith and the promise of a new beginning. The city that had once rejected them now faced them in battle, determined to crush the rising force of Islam. Yet, again and again, smaller forces stood against larger ones, and faith proved stronger than fear, and behind every victory, whispered in prayer and remembered in silence, was the lesson of the year of the elephant, that the designs of the proud could be overturned in a single moment by the will of God. When at last Muhammad returned to Mecca, no longer as an exile but as its honored leader, the Kaaba awaited him, silent and ancient. He entered the sacred mosque, raised his hand, and swept away the idols that had gathered over centuries around the house built by Ibrahim. The stones fell, and with them fell the last barriers between the Kaaba and its true purpose, to be a house of pure monotheism, where no creature shared in the worship due only to the Creator. In that moment, the story of the year of the elephant came full circle. The Kaaba had been protected not so it might remain forever in error, but so it might one day be restored to the faith of Ibrahim and Ismail. And as Muhammad stood before it, reciting verses that spoke of God's oneness and mercy, the memory of that protection became not just a story of the past but a prophecy fulfilled. After the Prophet's death, Islam spread beyond the borders of Arabia, carried by hearts that remembered the story of small birds defeating a mighty army. In lands far from Mecca, where the language and customs were different, the story still spoke to believers, a timeless reminder of humility and faith. And as empires rose and fell, as cities flourished and crumbled, the Kaaba remained, drawing millions to its courtyard, each pilgrim part of an unbroken line, stretching back to that year when divine power revealed itself so clearly. In the centuries that followed, scholars would debate the details of the event. Some spoke of epidemics or natural disasters. Others held fast to the miraculous intervention described in the Quran. Yet even among those who searched for historical explanations, few denied the profound impact of the event on Arab consciousness. It changed how the people of Mecca saw themselves, and how the tribes of Arabia saw the Kaaba. It was no longer merely a tribal shrine. It was a house protected by God, destined to stand at the heart of a faith that would encompass the world. Travelers from distant lands came to Mecca, drawn by stories of a sanctuary unlike any other. They heard of the Kaaba's deliverance, of elephants turned back by birds, and carried these stories home, where they were woven into local traditions and legends. In the mosques of Africa, in the markets of Persia, in the scholarly circles of Andalusia, the year of the elephant became part of a shared memory that united believers across languages and borders. And so the story endures, not only as history but as a living lesson. It tells that pride and power, no matter how imposing, can crumble before the smallest act of divine will. It teaches that faith, though unseen, and often mocked by the powerful, holds within it a strength that cannot be measured by armies or wealth, and it reminds every heart that turns in prayer toward the Kaaba that they are part of something far greater than themselves, a story written by the one who commands the birds and the winds, the hearts and the histories of nations. In Mecca today, where marble floors reflect the golden light of dawn and minarets rise into the sky, the memory of the year of the elephant still lives. It lives in the quiet awe that pilgrims feel as they first set eyes on the Kaaba, in the whispered prayers that ask for protection and mercy, in the tearful voices that recite the Quran's verses recounting that day of deliverance. And it lives, most of all, in the enduring faith that what is meant to be protected will be protected, and that the plans of the arrogant must always bow before the will of the most merciful. Thus the desert remembers. And so do hearts, century after century, as long as stories are told and prayers are whispered under the wide, starry sky. And so it is that the story of the year of the elephant has never truly ended. From the moment the birds flew above Abraha's army to the present day, its echoes have traveled through hearts, books, sermons, and silent prayers whispered before dawn. It lives in the rhythm of pilgrim footsteps circling the Kaaba, in the verses of Seerah al-Fil recited by millions whose tongues may differ but whose faith unites them. The Kaaba still stands, black-draped and serene, a living testimony to a promise kept long before our time that what God protects remains protected, despite all the pride and plans of those who would see it fall. For generations, the story has offered not only history but hope, hope that the weakest may triumph when guided by faith, that true power does not always wear a crown or march with elephants, and that the unseen hand, which turned back an army, still guides and protects hearts turned sincerely to him. Though centuries have passed, and the world has changed beyond anything those early Meccans could have imagined, the lesson of that year remains as bright as ever. And so, in the hearts of believers, the year of the elephant is never truly past. It remains a sign, a reminder, and a quiet promise for every generation to come. Faith is stronger than force. Arrogance always meets its limit. What God protects remains protected.